So now we'll turn and we're going to look at Christianity and the end of Christendom. This period of time, we'll actually start to look at things that are going on in Latin America, as well as things that are going on with the Latin American church in North America, in the United States. So, for example, we talked about the Mexican Revolution that started in 1910 and the fact that it drove more people, more immigrants and refugees into the United States. And during this time, Mexican immigrants and refugees were mostly ignored or met with hostility within both Catholic and Protestant churches and institutions. For example, in the early 30s, Edward Hanna, the leader of the Archdiocese of San Francisco, makes horrible remarks about Mexicans in a letter to a delegate asking for immigration to be restricted. So then why is this designation the time of the end of Christendom? Let's go back to La Manzana's distinction between the three, where he says there's Christendom, there's global Christianity, and then there's world Christianity. However, during this time, as these independent states and countries have arisen in Latin America, there's something comes up, which is the new Christendom, which is alliances with powerful governments and industries. So, for example, the Catholic Church in those areas become really comfy with the government of Argentina, Brazil, Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and Nicaragua. However, the Protestants and the evangelicals during the same time were sympathetic to these liberalizing tendencies, such as religious liberty, secularization of the national institutions and such. This led both to the Catholic Church and the conservatives to deem them suspicious for several reasons, or to see them as traitors or even agents of the United States. And as a form of Protestantism, the growing Pentecostal movement saw a lot of that persecution. Joel M. Cruz says these early Pentecostals were often shunned, challenged, or even violently persecuted within their communities, sometimes at the instigation of local priests. During these early decades, Pentecostalism spread mainly among the poor, immigrants, laborers, and the dispossessed. Though overall the movement did not experience significant growth until after the 1950s, denominations began to proliferate nonetheless. But this particular form of the church-state relationship, this new Christendom, wouldn't last long in Latin America. Joel M. Cruz goes on, he says, as populist governments began to crumble under military dictatorships, beginning in the late 1950s, it became apparent to many that the new Christendom model was a failure. So meanwhile, in the United States, slowly and with much tension, Mexican Americans become leaders and priests within the Catholic Church through this period, through the 30s. And this culminates in this also corresponds to something happened within Protestant circles. In the Hispanic Church, for example, among evangelicals, there's in 1939, the Rio Grande Conference, and then in 1941, the Latin American Provisional Conference are established. And this also is corresponding to some things that are going on in South America as well. So, for example, in 1949, Latin American Evangelical Conference, the CELA, forms in Buenos Aires. This is the same year that Billy Graham really gains nationwide prominence in America. This is also the same year that the CIA engineered a coup that deposes Jacob Arbenz and installs a military dictatorship in Guatemala. And so there are a lot of things that are going on within evangelicalism and Protestantism, broadly speaking, and Catholicism, and church and state relationships. And so in the 50s and 60s, here in America, Mexican American clergy grow in significant numbers. And in South America, in the late 50s, Catholic Church initially supports people like Castro because of their focus on the poor. And then back up in America, the United States, the emerging Chicano movement, which are first generation Mexican Americans, they motivate Protestant and Catholic church leaders to develop theologies from a Latina perspective. For example, we see the La Raza. This is a picture from a little bit later, technically outside of this time period that we're looking at, but it really captures what's going on during this time. It says the church belongs to the people. In the same sense that the church belongs to the people is not just a sentiment of protesters. In 1969, the newly appointed Archbishop of Texas recommends Father Patricio Flores, someone whom he had never met, to be his auxiliary bishop. Says, when the authorities asked for 2 more names, he returned the paperwork with Flores's name written 3 times. He says directly, if I had 3 Mexican Americans who were equally qualified, I would write them all down. To get an auxiliary bishop in Texas, we don't want to go to California. The auxiliary should be a native. So in 1970, the first Hispanic bishop in the United States is appointed. Now let's back up just for a few years and start again at 1964. Then this marks a new era in the church, especially in North America and North, Central, and South America. This date was chosen because of the Civil Rights Act that's happening in the United States at this time that passes this year in 1964. However, in the next year, a Colombian priest, Camilo Torres, says something that really captures the spirit of what happens during this era. He says, revolution is the way to obtain a government that will feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and teach the unschooled. Revolution will produce a government that carries out works of charity, of love, for one fellows, not for only a few, but for the majority of our fellow men. This is why the revolution is not only permissible, but obligatory. A look at just a few books that come out during this time really, once again, capture the spirit of something that is changing drastically. So in 1964, Dr. King writes this book, Why We Can't Wait. And in that, he critiques what he calls incrementalism. And then these other books are written during this time. You see the one here, A Theology of Human Hope, but the original title for the doctoral dissertation aspect was Toward a Theology of Liberation. And this is where this idea comes from, of liberation theology. And then in 1970, you have James Cone in the United States publishing this work. And so you see this conversation kind of going back and forth within these theological minds, these people who are have their finger on the pulse of what is going on in the people, with the people of the places that they're caring for and thinking about. And then we have Gutierrez in 1971 publishes A Theology of Liberation. This has become part of the vernacular. And Gutierrez says he critiques some of the same things that King is critiquing, what King calls incrementalism. Gutierrez talks about, he says, developmentalism thus came to be synonymous with reformism and modernization. That is to say, synonymous with timid measures, really ineffective in the long run and counterproductive to achieving a real transformation. So they're after something that is much deeper change than mere adaptations or slow growth. And so in 1968, Dr. King is assassinated. And this is the same year that Paulo Freire, his work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is also published. And it's the same year that Ruben Alden's book, A Theology of Human Hope, there is published. And in the preface to it, the later Brazilian edition of his book, he wrote about the backlash this book received after its initial publication. He says, there were more than 40 accusations that we preached that Jesus had sexual relations with a prostitute, that we were delighted when our children wrote phrases of hate against the Americans, that we were subversives with funds from the Soviet Union. But the tragedy was precisely this, that people of the church, brothers and sisters, pastors and presbyters, were so ready to denounce us. I'm sure he has partially in mind here the fact that during this time, the Pope, or later than this, the Pope John Paul II openly opposes liberation theology and replaces left-leaning bishops with conservatives. And still there's a lot of strange church and state relationships, things going on here. For example, during this time period, for example, Pinochet is the dictator in Chile and evangelicals support him, while many Catholic and mainline Protestant leaders denounce him because of human rights abuses. And then in 1980 to 92, the Salvadorian civil wars fought and government militias target Catholic leaders. It's partially because of this, because they are advocating for these people and for these drastic changes to how people are treated. But it wasn't just theologians that were concerned about these things. For example, we have Archbishop Oscar Romero, and he says, as a church, we are not political experts, nor do we wish to manage the mechanisms of politics. But if we are to uphold faith in a God of life and to follow Jesus in truth and not only in words, it is necessary and urgent that we be engaged in the socio-political world where the life and death of the majorities are at stake. The church will go on supporting the specifics of one political project or another, depending on how it affects the poor. And you see here, this is Romero here in the center, and to his left is Dr. King, and to his right is Bonhoeffer. And he's there because these are statues of the 20th century martyrs on the facade above the Great West Door of Westminster Abbey in London. During this time, in 1980, while he was consecrating the Eucharist during Mass, he was assassinated. Someone came into the church, and a lot of people speculate that it was actually the El Salvadoran government that came in and assassinated him. And it said that his own blood was mixed with the wine as this happened. But this was not the only violent reaction to the church. 3 U.S. nuns and a lay missionary were also murdered in El Salvador that same year. And then just 9 years later, 6 Jesuits, their housekeeper and her daughter, were murdered by U.S. trained commandos of the armed forces in El Salvador. And then that same year, the U.S. invades Panama. So there's a lot of change and political chaos going on as these relationships are changing or have changed. Yet there's also something else going on in South America. As the Pentecostalism movement, or as Pentecostalism grows and begins really thriving during this time, the Catholic charismatic renewal movement is also happening. So the charismatic movement isn't just among Protestants, it's also happening among Catholics as well. This is popular in Brazil and a few other places. However, also in the Pentecostalism movement are smaller independent churches. So in 1989, we see a form of the prosperity gospel being preached in Honduras with the Via Abundante sermon saying, "Open your Bibles and read for yourselves, convince yourselves, loved ones, I want you to do well in just some things." And the congregation responds, "No, of course. In all things, it is about prosperity in all areas. You shall prosper in all areas." Which are they? In all. All things are all things. Everything means everything. What is everything? Your shoes, your laundry, and so forth. All prosper in God. So that's in 1989. And so 3 years later, something really significant is marked. In 1992, Pope John Paul II, on the 500th year anniversary of contact between Europeans and Native Americans and the indigenous populations of Central and South America, sends messages to these people and to their descendants, essentially, and to African Americans. He says, "In the name of Jesus Christ, as a pastor of the church, I beg you to forgive all who have been unjust towards you, to forgive all who during those 500 years have caused you and your ancestors pain. The church, which has accompanied you during those 500 years, will do everything in its power to ensure that the descendants of the ancient peoples of America will achieve their rightful place in society and in the ecclesial community." And then he goes on to say, "Everyone knows well the injustice committed against those Black populations of the African continent, which were violently torn away from their lands, cultures, and traditions, and brought to America as slaves. Therefore, in this commemoration and commemoration of the quincentennial, I exhort you to defend your identity, to be aware of your dignity, and make it fruitful." So that then makes this next step, very significant. We'll see kind of a thematic connection to something that happens next. In 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, is elected as Pope Francis. And this is significant because he is the first Latin American Pope. And this is a big deal. And I'm not suggesting that this was necessarily a PR move on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church or anything like that, but it is a mark of difference in the way that the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has treated and been in a relationship with the peoples of Central and South America. However, this brings us back to the pictures that we initially looked at, asking what the relationship between them were. And this brings us to this very interesting thing that has happened in South America. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but so this is a replica of Solomon's Temple built in 2014, just the year after Pope Francis, or year after he becomes Pope Francis. And it's built by one of Brazil's biggest and wealthiest neo-Pentecostal churches. This building can hold up to 10,000 worshipers, and it's over 4 times larger than the original temple, than the Solomon's Temple originally. However, that comparison is not as relevant as another. Philip Jenkins, the excellent church historian, says that this figure is no accident. The Temple of Solomon was specifically designed to be twice the size of the country's famous Catholic symbol, the statue Christ the Redeemer, overlooking Rio de Janeiro. So what do these 3 things have in common, and what do they have to say about Latin American Christianity? Well, according to a 2022 Wall Street Journal article, one published this year, entitled "Why the Catholic Church is Losing Latin America," they say it's a testament to evangelicalism's massive growth in Central and South America. In that same article, they talk about, they identify these statistics, and they say 19% of Latin Americans identified themselves as Protestants. Of those, 65% identified with Pentecostalism. And even among Roman Catholics in 2020, 22.8% of Catholics in Latin America were charismatics as well. In that same Wall Street Journal article, they say in a symbolic milestone, Brazil, which has the most Catholics of any country in the world, is expected to become minority Catholic as soon as this year. They go on to say that the rise of liberation theology in the 60s and 70s, a time when the Catholic Church in Latin America increasingly stressed its mission as one of social justice, in some cases drawing on Marxist ideas, failed to counter the appeal of Protestant faiths, or in the words of a now legendary quip, variously attributed to Catholic and Protestant sources, the Catholic Church opted for the poor, and the poor opted for the Pentecostals. For example, they tell this detailed story of this man, Martins, who comes to faith after a local Pentecostal church in Rio de Janeiro funded his drug rehab program and found him a job. And they go on to say that unlike larger Catholic churches in the area, the informal structure of the Pentecostal and evangelical churches allows for greater contact between church leaders and worshipers like Mr. Martins. There's a quote from him. He says, "The Catholic priest wouldn't even have coffee with us." And in the US, to come back up to the United States to see what has happened since, according to Reverend Dr. Gabriel Salguero, at 9 to 10 million Hispanic evangelicals living in the United States are the fastest growing segment of evangelicals in the United States. He says this in an interview with the Holy Post, episode 501. He says, think about the late 40s and early 50s, the heyday of white evangelicalism and the institution building that happened. Gordon Conwell Seminary, Fuller, Christianity Today, Wheaton, the influence of Billy Graham, Harold Ockenga, and so many others. I think we're living that moment. I think we're living that moment in Hispanic evangelicalism now. So I want to end with a quote from a source, a Protestant historian, reflecting on these relationships. His name is Edwin E. Sylvest, and this was predicted. He wrote this in the early 2000s, but I think it's an apt note to end on. He says, increasingly, there are signs that a Hispanic church of the people is stirring within Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Though relations between these two great Christian traditions are no less problematic now than in the past, in the complex variety of forms and practice, there is a continual formation, a Hispanic Christian community that is Catholic in its concern and ministry and committed to the embodiment in the flesh of La Raza of the suffering love of one who died servant of all, yet Lord of all, the sign of the coming liberation of all humanity.